The observation chamber hummed with a low frequency that made Krell's sensory stalks ache. He pressed 3 of his 6 manipulator limbs against the transparent barrier, watching the blue planet rotate slowly on the holographic display. Earth, they called it, a backwater world in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. Krell had been an observer for the Galactic Council for 200 cycles. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, had documented first contacts, had recorded the final moments of dying stars. Nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The humans have declared war on the Vrex Collective, announced observer Prime Thalzine, her crystalline form refracting the dim light of the chamber into rainbow patterns across the walls. You will document everything. Every battle, every strategy, every moment of their inevitable defeat. Krell felt his center mass contract with unease. The Vrex Collective was not just powerful. They were efficient, ruthless, and had conquered 47 systems in the past decade alone. Their Jan ships moved like schools of predatory fish through space, overwhelming enemies with sheer numbers and coordinated strikes. The humans? Krell had studied their file during the journey to this observation post. They had barely achieved faster-than-light travel 50 cycles ago. Their weapons technology was primitive by galactic standards. Their military structure seemed chaotic and inefficient. They fought among themselves almost constantly, wasting resources on petty territorial disputes. Why do we observe? Krell asked, though he knew the answer. The outcome is certain. Thalzine's form pulsed with what might have been amusement. The Council wants documentation of humanity's final stand. They refused the Vrex terms of submission. Refused peaceful annexation. The humans chose war over servitude. She paused, her light dimming slightly. The Council believes this will serve as a cautionary tale for other species who might consider resistance. Krell activated his recording implants and settled into the observation couch. The neural interface connected smoothly, allowing him to perceive multiple data streams simultaneously. Military communications, ship movements, weapon deployments, casualty reports. Everything would flow directly into his consciousness and be stored in the Council's archives. The first battle began 3 hours later. The Vrex sent a standard subjugation fleet. 12 heavy cruisers, 40 destroyers, and over 200 fighter craft. They entered the human system designated Proxima, with their weapons charged and shields at maximum. The attack formation was textbook perfect, honed through countless successful conquests. The human defenders numbered 7 ships. 7 aging vessels that looked like they had been assembled from scrap metal and desperate hope. Krell felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Pity? Respect for their foolish courage? The Vrex commander sent the standard surrender demand. Krell translated the harsh clicking language. Submit or be destroyed. You cannot win. Resistance is death. The human response came in their strange, varied tongue. The translation matrix rendered it into common galactic speech. Come and take it. What happened next shattered every assumption Krell had made about human warfare. The human ships didn't retreat. They didn't try to fight a defensive battle. They accelerated directly toward the Vrex fleet at speeds that made Krell's sensors scream warnings about structural integrity. The humans were pushing their vessels beyond safe operational limits. Then they fired, but not at the Vrex ships. They fired at the asteroids drifting in the outer system. Massive kinetic rounds struck space rocks, sending thousands of tons of stone and metal hurtling toward the Vrex formation at incredible velocities. The Vrex scattered, breaking their perfect formation to avoid the improvised projectiles. In that moment of chaos, the human ship struck. They didn't engage in the long-range energy weapon exchanges that characterized most galactic warfare. They closed to point-blank range, their hulls actually scraping against Vrex shields. One human ship rammed directly into a Vrex cruiser. The explosion was catastrophic, destroying both vessels. But in the wreckage, Krell saw something that made his sensory stalks quiver. Escape pods, dozens of them, launched in the seconds before impact. The human crew had known they would die, had planned for it, and had still pressed the attack. The remaining human ships used the explosion as cover. They emerged from the debris field with their weapons blazing, targeting not the Vrex ship's weapons or shields, but their communication arrays and sensor clusters. The Vrex fleet began firing wildly, hitting their own ships as often as the humans. 3 more human vessels died in those chaotic minutes. But when the battle ended, the Vrex had lost 18 ships and retreated in disarray. 4 human ships remained, damaged but operational. Krell sat frozen in his observation couch, his recording implants burning with data. This wasn't how warfare worked in the galaxy. Civilized species fought with precision, with established rules of engagement, with an understanding that wars were expensive and should be concluded efficiently. The humans fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Over the next planetary rotation, Krell reviewed the battle data obsessively. He analyzed the human communications during the fight. There had been no panic, no desperation in their voices. Instead, he heard laughter. Actual laughter as they dove into impossible situations. He heard them encouraging each other, making jokes even as their ships fell apart around them. One transmission haunted him. A human captain, her ship's hull breached and life support failing, had sent a final message to her fleet. Worth it. Make them remember us. They would. Krell was certain the Vrex would remember this battle, but so would he. The image of that ship accelerating into the enemy even as it died was burned into his memory nodes. Thalzine appeared beside his station, her crystalline form glowing softly. Interesting tactics, she observed, but ultimately futile. The Vrex will send a larger fleet. Human courage cannot overcome mathematics. Krell didn't respond. He was watching the human survivors limp back to their station, already making repairs, already preparing for the next fight. On the station's communication channels, he could hear them talking. Not about surrender, not about peace negotiations. They were arguing about how to fight better next time. Something cold settled in Krell's center mass, a feeling he had never experienced in 200 cycles of observation. He was beginning to suspect that the Council had made a terrible miscalculation about humanity. This wasn't going to be a simple documentation of defeat. This was going to be something much worse or much better, depending on which side you stood on. And Krell, bound by his oath as an observer, could only watch as it unfolded. The Vrex returned 30 cycles later with a fleet that blotted out the stars. 300 warships, enough firepower to reduce a planet to molten slag. Krell watched them approach the human colony world of New Perth, their formation precise and overwhelming. The humans had been busy during those 30 cycles. Intelligence reports showed they had evacuated most of the civilian population, turning the colony into a massive military installation. Every building had been fortified. Every civilian transport had been converted into a weapon. The orbital stations bristled with cannons that looked like they had been stripped from destroyed ships and welded onto any available surface. Krell studied the human preparations with growing unease. They weren't preparing for a battle. They were preparing for a slaughter. Their own slaughter, if necessary, but they intended to make it costly. The Vrex commander, a veteran named Zekthar who had crushed 20 rebellions, sent his ultimatum. The translation was simple. Surrender in 1 hour or we reduce your world to ash. The human response came from their military coordinator, a woman named General Sarah Chen. Krell had been monitoring her communications for weeks. She was 53 cycles old by human reckoning, had fought in 4 of their interspecies conflicts, and had a reputation for what humans called aggressive defense. You have 300 ships, Chen's voice crackled across the void. I'm looking at your formation right now. Nice and tight. Probably think it looks intimidating. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to attack, because that's what your tactical doctrine demands, and we're going to make you regret every meter you advance. Zekthar's response was to open fire. Hundreds of energy beams lanced down toward the colony. The human shields held for approximately 4 seconds before collapsing. Buildings evaporated under the assault. Then the humans revealed what they had been building. The entire colony was wired with fusion charges, not to destroy the Vrex ships directly, but to superheat the atmosphere itself. The resulting shockwave disrupted the Vrex targeting systems and sent a pulse of electromagnetic energy through their formation. 40. Vrex ships lost power simultaneously. The human ground-based railguns fired in that moment of confusion. Not explosive rounds, but solid tungsten rods accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The projectiles punched through Vrex shields like they weren't even there, coring ships from stem to stern. Krell's sensory stalks trembled as he processed what he was seeing. The humans had sacrificed their own colony, deliberately destroyed it to create a single moment of tactical advantage, and they had used it with surgical precision, but the Vrex had numbers. They pressed the attack, landing troops on what remained of the colony's surface. 50,000 Vrex soldiers, heavily armored and equipped with weapons that could level buildings. They deployed in standard planetary assault formation, securing landing zones and establishing command posts. The humans were waiting underground. Miles of tunnels that they had spent 30 cycles preparing. The Vrex advanced into a three-dimensional maze where their numbers meant nothing, and their superior technology couldn't acquire targets fast enough. Krell watched through battlefield sensors as human soldiers engaged in close combat. They used primitive projectile weapons that shouldn't have been effective against Vrex armor, but the humans aimed for joints, for sensor clusters, for the weak points that no armor could fully protect. They moved in small groups, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before the Vrex could coordinate a response. One engagement particularly captured Krell's attention. A human squad of 8 soldiers faced a Vrex platoon of 40. The humans should have retreated or been destroyed. Instead, they collapsed a tunnel behind the Vrex force, cutting them off from support. Then they systematically hunted the Vrex through the darkness, using the terrain and their smaller size to devastating effect. The human squad leader, a young male named Rodriguez, communicated constantly with his team. Krell listened to the tactical chatter. It was efficient, professional, but interspersed with phrases that made no sense. Remember your training. Stay frosty. Make every shot count. And strangest of all, this is for New Tokyo. Krell checked his files. New Tokyo had been a human colony destroyed by the Vrex in the initial wave of attacks. These soldiers were fighting with a motivation that went beyond military duty. They were fighting with something the galactic community had long considered primitive and inefficient, a desire for revenge. The battle for New Perth lasted 6 planetary rotations. The Vrex eventually won, claiming the shattered remains of the colony, but they had lost 97 ships and 32,000 soldiers. The humans had inflicted a casualty rate of 3-1 against a superior force. It should have been impossible. Thalzine materialized beside Krell's station, her crystalline form dimmer than usual. The Council is disturbed by these losses, she said quietly. The Vrex are requesting additional fleets. They're calling the humans unreasonable in their prosecution of warfare. Krell would have laughed if his species was capable of such expressions. Unreasonable. The Vrex had expected a quick conquest, a demonstration of power that would force humanity to submit. Instead, they were locked in a grinding war of attrition with an enemy that refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. He accessed the human military communications again. General Chen was addressing her remaining forces from a command ship in deep space. The colony was gone. Thousands of her soldiers were dead, but her voice was steady and strong. We lost New Perth, Chen told her troops. We will lose other worlds, but every battle costs them. Every ship they lose, every soldier we kill, brings them closer to the point where this war becomes too expensive to continue. We're not trying to win every battle. We're trying to make them lose the war. It was a strategy that defied conventional galactic military thinking. Civilized species negotiated peace terms when losses reached a certain threshold. They understood that some wars couldn't be won and accepted reasonable surrender conditions. The humans were operating on a completely different principle. They would accept any loss, sustain any casualty rate, as long as they inflicted damage on their enemy. Krell watched the Vrex fleet depart from New Perth's orbit. Their ships damaged and their formations ragged. They had won the battle. But as he analyzed their communications, he could hear something new in the clicking and chittering of Vrex language. Frustration, uncertainty, fear. The humans were supposed to be a minor annoyance, a brief conflict to demonstrate Vrex dominance. Instead, they had become a bleeding wound that wouldn't stop hemorrhaging resources and soldiers. And the war was just beginning. Krell deactivated his recording implants and allowed himself a moment of personal reflection, something observers were discouraged from doing. He had documented hundreds of conflicts. He understood the patterns of warfare, the inevitable trajectories of conquest and submission. But the humans weren't following those patterns. They were writing new rules, and those rules were written in blood and fire and stubborn, impossible determination. His center mass contracted with something that might have been dread. The Council wanted him to document humanity's defeat. But what if he was actually documenting the moment the galaxy learned to fear a species that refused to quit, that treated impossible odds as merely difficult challenges? that turned every loss into a lesson for the next fight. Krell returned to his observations, knowing that the worst was yet to come. For someone, he was no longer certain who. Krell had stopped sleeping. His species could go without rest for extended periods, but after 90 cycles of continuous observation, his neural pathways were beginning to fray. Still, he couldn't look away. The war had evolved into something that his training had never prepared him to understand. The humans had stopped defending planets, at least not in any conventional sense. After losing 6 colony worlds, they had shifted to what they called mobile warfare. Every civilian transport, every merchant vessel, every ship that could mount a weapon or carry soldiers had been converted into a military asset. The human fleet now consisted of over 2,000 vessels, none of them matching. Most of them held together with what appeared to be improvised repairs and desperate engineering. They struck at Vrex supply lines, at isolated patrols, at poorly defended outposts. They never fought fair. They never engaged unless they had a significant advantage. And they never ever stopped coming. Krell watched a raid on a Vrex fuel depot in the Kepler system. 20 human ships, most of them converted cargo haulers, dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the depot's defensive perimeter. The Vrex garrison had 40 seconds of warning before the humans were among them. The human ships didn't try to destroy the depot with weapons. They rammed cargo containers full of refined antimatter directly into the fuel storage tanks. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. The humans lost all 20 ships. The Vrex lost their primary refueling station for the entire sector and 800 personnel. It was insane. It was wasteful. It was terrifyingly effective. The Vrex commander, Zekthar, who had survived the New Perth campaign, sent a priority communication to the Vrex High Command. Krell intercepted it, as he intercepted all battlefield communications. The translation software struggled with the emotion in Zekthar's voice. These humans do not fight like rational beings. They sacrifice ships like we sacrifice ammunition. Every engagement is a potential trap. Every victory feels hollow because we know they're planning the next attack. My fleet has lost 30% effectiveness not from battle damage, but from crew stress and uncertainty. The humans are everywhere and nowhere. We cannot predict them. We cannot deter them. And they are learning. That last part made Krell's sensory stalks quiver. Learning. The humans were analyzing every battle, every tactic the Vrex employed, and adapting. In the span of 100 cycles, human military doctrine had evolved 3 times. They had started with desperate courage and improvised tactics. Now they fought with a cold, calculated aggression that seemed almost algorithmic in its efficiency. Krell accessed human military communications and found himself eavesdropping on a strategy session aboard the human flagship, a massive vessel they had named Indomitable, with typical human flair for dramatic naming conventions. Admiral James Kowalski was addressing his command staff. The admiral was 70 cycles old, ancient by human standards, but his mind was sharp and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and learned from all of it. The Vrex think we're fighting a war of attrition, Kowalski said. His image transmitted across multiple command ships. They're wrong. We're fighting a war of transformation. Every battle changes us. Every loss teaches us. We're not trying to outlast them. We're trying to evolve faster than they can adapt. One of his officers, a woman named Commander Park, raised a concern. Sir, our casualty rates are approaching 40% across all military branches. Morale is holding, but we're losing experienced personnel faster than we can replace them. Kowalski nodded, and Krell could see something in the human's expression that his translation software labeled as grim determination. I know. Every name, every ship, every soldier we lose is recorded. The Council of Admirals reviews each casualty report personally. We're not being callous with human life. We're being realistic about the cost of survival. The Vrex wanted a quick subjugation. We're giving them a war that will break them economically, militarily, and psychologically. That requires sacrifice. Another officer spoke up, a young male with cybernetic implants replacing an arm lost in battle. The new weapon systems are ready for deployment. The Vrex won't see them coming. Krell felt his center mass contract with anticipation. New weapons? The humans had been using primarily kinetic and conventional explosive weapons, occasionally supplemented with stolen Vrex technology. What had they developed? He found out 3 cycles later. A Vrex assault fleet, 200 ships strong, entered the human system designated Last hope. Intelligence had indicated minimal human presence, and the Vrex intended to establish a forward operating base. They deployed in standard formation, began scanning for targets, and activated their sensor grids. The humans had been waiting in the system's asteroid belt, but they weren't hiding on asteroids or behind them. They had hollowed out hundreds of asteroids and turned them into autonomous weapon platforms, each equipped with advanced AI targeting systems and weapons that Krell's sensors identified as human-designed nuclear pulse drives. The asteroids moved. Slowly at first, then accelerating to speeds that shouldn't have been possible for objects their size. They didn't explode when they hit Vrex shields. They punched through, their massive momentum overcoming energy barriers designed to deflect much smaller projectiles. 70 Vrex ships were destroyed in the first wave. The survivors scattered, trying to retreat, but the automated weapon platforms pursued them. The human fleet, only 50 ships, emerged from hiding and picked off the confused Vrex vessels one by one. Krell watched the battle from his observation post, his recording implants burning with data. The humans hadn't just adapted to Vrex tactics. They had created entirely new forms of warfare, utilizing their system's natural resources and their species' apparent gift for unconventional thinking. The Vrex lost 140 ships. The humans lost 7. It was the first time the humans had achieved a significant numerical victory, and Krell knew the implications would reverberate throughout the galaxy. Thalzine appeared beside him, her crystalline form pulsing with agitation. The Council is convening an emergency session. Several member species are questioning the Vrex ability to complete this subjugation. There are suggestions that peace negotiations should be offered. Krell turned his sensory stalks toward her. Will the Vrex accept that suggestion? No, their pride is wounded. They've committed too many resources to withdraw now, and they believe correctly that showing weakness against humanity will encourage other species to resist future Vrex expansion. Thalzine's light dimmed. This will escalate, she was right. Over the next 20 cycles, the Vrex began deploying increasingly brutal tactics. They stopped offering surrender terms. They began targeting human civilian populations deliberately, hoping to break human morale. They destroyed evacuation ships, bombarded refugee stations, and broadcast images of the destruction to human military channels. Krell expected the humans to break. Every psychological profile suggested that targeting civilians would create internal pressure for peace negotiations. Instead, something else happened. The humans got angry, not the hot, explosive anger that burned out quickly. This was cold, patient fury that made their military operations even more efficient and ruthless. Human forces stopped taking Vrex prisoners. They stopped attempting to disable Vrex ships. Every engagement became a battle of annihilation. Krell watched a human commander named Captain Maria Santos address her crew before a raid on a Vrex command carrier. Her words were simple and terrible. They wanted to make this a war without rules. They succeeded. No mercy, no prisoners, no hesitation. Make them remember why you don't awaken the predator. The raid was successful. The Vrex command carrier was destroyed with all hands. The human ship sustained heavy damage but survived. As they limped away from the battle, Krell heard Santos speaking to her crew again. Her voice different now, quieter and sad. Document everything we did here. Every action, every decision. When this war is over, we'll have to answer for what we've become. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Today we survive. Krell deactivated his recording implants and sat in the darkness of the observation chamber. He had been documenting this conflict for 150 cycles, and he was beginning to understand a terrible truth about humanity. They were capable of both profound compassion and calculated brutality. They could mourn their enemies while destroying them. They could acknowledge the moral cost of their actions while continuing to commit them. The galaxy had no framework for understanding a species like that. And Krell was beginning to suspect that neither did he. The war entered its 200th cycle, and Krell had become something he had never expected to be, an expert on human psychology and warfare. The Council regularly requested his analysis, wanting to understand how a species that should have been crushed was instead stalemating one of the galaxy's premier military powers. Krell provided reports, but he knew his observations were incomplete. There was something about humanity that couldn't be captured in tactical analysis or casualty statistics. It existed in the spaces between data points, In the way human soldiers spoke to each other before battle, in the messages they recorded for loved ones they might never see again. The Vreks had begun to change their strategy. Instead of massive fleet actions, they deployed smaller, more mobile forces designed to counter human hit-and-run tactics. It was an admission that human methods were effective, that conventional galactic warfare doctrine had failed against Earth's defenders. Krell watched as both sides settled into a grinding war of attrition across 40 star systems. No single battle was decisive anymore. Instead, there were hundreds of small engagements, each one bleeding resources and personnel from both forces. The Vreks had superior numbers and production capacity. The humans had intimate knowledge of their territory, and an ability to extract maximum value from every resource. What disturbed Krell most was how the humans maintained their fighting spirit. He had observed civilizations at war before. After 200 cycles of conflict, populations demanded peace. War weariness set in. Dissent grew. But human civilian populations seemed to become more determined as the war dragged on. They converted their entire economy to military production. They volunteered for hazardous duty in numbers that exceeded military requirements. They sent care packages and messages to soldiers they had never met. Krell accessed public human communications networks and found propaganda videos, motivational speeches, and artistic expressions about the war. One video, viewed by millions of humans, showed children drawing pictures of soldiers. Another showed elderly humans working in factories, building ammunition with arthritic hands. A third showed a wedding ceremony conducted aboard a military vessel, the bride and groom both in uniform, both scheduled for combat deployment the next cycle. Humans were treating this war as a defining moment of their species' existence. They weren't fighting because they had to. They were fighting because they believed their survival depended on victory, and they had decided that survival was worth any cost. Thalzine visited his observation station less frequently now. The Council had assigned her to multiple simultaneous conflicts, stretching her attention across the galaxy. But she appeared one cycle with news that made Krell's sensory stalks contract with concern. The Vreks High Command has authorized the use of planet killers, she said without preamble. They intend to destroy 3 human colony worlds as a demonstration. They believe this will finally break human resistance. Krell felt something he hadn't experienced in his long career as an observer. Horror. The Council permits this? The Council debates. But the Vreks have operated within their rights under galactic warfare conventions. The targets are legitimate military objectives, regardless of civilian populations. Thalzine's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been regret. We can only observe and document. 3 cycles later, the Vreks deployed their planet-killing weapons. Massive devices that could fracture a world's crust and render it uninhabitable. The targets were New Harmony, Terra Nova, and Eden's Gate. Combined population, 15 million humans. The humans detected the incoming weapons and launched a desperate evacuation. Krell watched through countless sensors as civilian transports fled the doomed worlds. They couldn't save everyone. Millions of humans remained on the surface when the planet killers struck. Krell forced himself to watch. To document, to record the death of worlds and the screams that crossed the void of space. It was his duty as an observer, but it felt like torture. The Vreks broadcast their success across all frequencies, demanding human surrender. They waited for the inevitable collapse of human morale, for the peace delegations, for the acknowledgement that resistance was futile. The human response came from Admiral Kowalski, now commanding the largest human fleet ever assembled. His message was broadcast on all channels, ensuring both the Vreks and the Galactic Council would hear it. You have murdered 15 million civilians. You have destroyed 3 worlds that can never be restored. You have shown the galaxy what your concept of civilization means. Kowalski's voice was quiet, but Krell could hear the rage beneath the calm. You wanted to break us. You have succeeded in breaking any hope of peace. This is no longer a war for territory or resources. This is a war of extinction. You will never know safety again. Every Vreks world, every Vreks ship, every Vreks soldier will look over their shoulder and wonder when we're coming. Because we are coming. And we will not stop until your civilization remembers this moment and regrets it for generations. Krell expected this to be empty rhetoric, a momentary emotional response to trauma. But over the next 40 cycles, he watched humans implement Kowalski's promise with terrifying efficiency. Human forces stopped defending their remaining colonies. They fortified a dozen core worlds and launched every available military asset into Vrex territory, not to conquer but to terrorize. Human ships struck at targets deep in Vrex space, hitting civilian infrastructure with the same callousness the Vrex had shown humanity. Vrex colonies began experiencing supply shortages. Vrex civilian transports required military escorts. Vrex core worlds, which had been safe for thousands of cycles, suddenly had to maintain defensive fleets. The psychological impact was devastating. The Vrex had never experienced war on their home territory. Now they understood what they had inflicted on humanity. Krell documented a raid on a Vrex industrial world. A dozen human ships, all of them damaged and held together with improvised repairs, penetrated the system's defenses through a combination of stealth, misdirection, and sheer audacity. They didn't target military installations. They struck at the world's water purification facilities, its food distribution centers, its medical production plants. Then they broadcast a message to the planet's population. You starve as we starve. You suffer as we suffer. You learn what war means. It was brutal. It was merciless. It was exactly what the Vrex had done to human worlds, but executed with a precision that suggested the humans had studied Vrex psychology extensively. Krell received a communication from Thalzine. Her crystalline form appeared as a hologram, and her light was dimmer than he had ever seen it. The Council is disturbed by human tactics. There are concerns that humanity has become the monster they're fighting. Krell considered her words carefully. They have not initiated genocide. They have not used planet killers. They are reflecting Vrex tactics back at the Vrex. Is this not what warfare means? You sound like you support them, Thalzine said, and there was something accusatory in her tone. I observe them, Krell replied. I document them, and I understand them better than I want to. The humans are not becoming monsters. They are showing the galaxy what happens when you force a peaceful species to become warriors. They adapt. They learn, and they apply those lessons with terrifying competence. Thalzine's hologram flickered. The Vrex are requesting peace negotiations. They claim the war has become too costly. Krell felt his center mass expand with surprise. The Vrex requesting peace? After 240 cycles of conflict, after destroying 3 human worlds, after promising total victory. Will the humans accept? He asked. I don't know, Thalzine admitted. The Council has sent envoys to both sides. But humans no longer trust galactic institutions. They believe we failed to protect them when the Vrex attacked. They may refuse mediation. Krell returned to his observations with a sense of dread. The war had transformed from a simple conquest attempt into something far more complex and dangerous. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding resources and population. But only one side had shown a willingness to negotiate before the enemy was completely destroyed. And Krell wasn't certain it was the humans. The peace negotiations began in neutral space, aboard a galactic council station that had been hastily converted into a diplomatic venue. Krell was ordered to attend as an official observer, his documentation of the war making him uniquely qualified to provide context for the proceedings. He entered the negotiation chamber with profound unease. On one side sat the Vrex delegation, led by High Commander Zekthar himself. The veteran warrior looked diminished somehow, his chitinous plate scarred from too many battles. On the other side sat the human delegation, led by a woman named Ambassador Catherine Reeves, accompanied by Admiral Kowalski and General Chen. The humans looked exhausted. 260 cycles of continuous warfare had marked them visibly, but their eyes were alert, calculating, watching the Vrex with the intensity of predators who had learned to never trust prey that might still have teeth. Council Arbiter Velmoth, a being of pure energy contained within a diplomatic housing, opened the proceedings. This war has lasted too long and cost too much. Both sides have demonstrated their military capabilities. Both sides have inflicted terrible losses. It is time for reason to prevail over conflict. Zekthar spoke first, his words translated from the clicking Vrex language into common galactic speech. The Vrex Collective acknowledges that humanity has proven to be a more formidable opponent than initially assessed. We are prepared to offer favorable peace terms. Human worlds will maintain autonomy. No reparations will be demanded. All we require is a mutual non-aggression treaty and trade agreements. Krell observed the human delegation carefully. They showed no reaction to these terms, which were actually quite generous by galactic standards. The Vrex were essentially offering to return to pre-war status, with humanity gaining nothing and losing nothing except the millions who had died. Ambassador Reeves stood slowly. She was a small woman by human standards, barely reaching Krell's center mass in height, but she carried herself with a quiet authority. "Let me make sure I understand," she said, her voice calm and professional. "You invaded our territory. You destroyed 6 of our colonies. You murdered 15 million civilians with planet-killing weapons, and now you want to shake hands and pretend it never happened." "We offer peace," Zekthar said, and there was something defensive in his tone. "What more do you demand?" Reeves placed a data tablet on the table. Justice, accountability, guarantees, and reparations that actually mean something. She activated the tablet, and holographic displays appeared throughout the chamber. "These are our terms. First, the Vrex Collective will formally acknowledge responsibility for initiating an aggressive war against a peaceful species. Second, you will provide full reparations for the destruction of our colonies calculated at current replacement value. Third, you will surrender the commanders responsible for deploying planet-killer weapons against civilian populations. They will face trial under human jurisdiction." The chamber erupted in chaos. Several council members objected immediately, claiming human terms were unprecedented and violated galactic diplomatic norms. Zekthar rose from his seat, his mandibles clicking with rage. "Unacceptable. You demand we surrender our military leadership? You demand reparations that would cripple our economy? These are not peace terms. This is humiliation." Kowalski stood beside Reeves, his aged face hard as stone. "You wanted peace. We're offering it. Just not the peace you expected. You thought you could murder millions of our people and then negotiate as equals. You were wrong." Velmoth's energy form pulsed with agitation. "Ambassador Reeves, these terms are punitive beyond standard galactic practice. The Council cannot support demands that would destabilize an entire civilization." Reeves turned her attention to the Council arbiter, and Krell saw something in her expression that made his sensory stalks quiver. It was the look of someone who had prepared for this moment, who had anticipated every objection. "With respect, Arbiter, humanity never asked to join your galactic community. We were minding our own business, exploring our local space, when the Vrex decided to add us to their collection of conquered species. We fought back, and now you're all uncomfortable because we fought back effectively." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The Vrex aren't the only ones in this room who failed humanity. The Galactic Council watched our colonies burn. You observed, you documented, you debated, but you did nothing to stop a war of aggression against a species that had committed no offense except existing in space the Vrex wanted." Krell felt those words like physical blows. She was right. The Council had done exactly what she described. He had done exactly what she described. Observed, documented, and done nothing. General Chen stood, adding her voice to the human position. "We didn't start this war, but we're going to finish it properly. Either the Vrex accept our terms and face the consequences of their actions, or we continue fighting until they have no choice. We've proven we can sustain this war indefinitely. Can they?" Zekthar's form seemed to deflate slightly. Krell realized the Vrex commander knew the answer to that question. The Vrex war machine was exhausted, their economy strained, their military overstretched across too many systems. The humans somehow had managed their resources more efficiently, had adapted their entire civilization to sustained conflict. "You would continue this war?" Zekthar asked quietly. "More deaths? More destruction? For pride?" "Not for pride," Reeves said, and now her voice carried an edge of steel. "For justice. And for the future. Because if we accept your easy peace, we send a message to every aggressive species in the galaxy. Attack humans, and the worst that happens is you get a draw. Murder millions of us and face no consequences. That's not acceptable, not to us, not to the humans who died believing their sacrifice meant something." The negotiations continued for 3 cycles. Krell watched as both sides argued, compromised slightly, and argued again. The Council attempted to mediate, offering various modifications to the human demands. But Reeves and her delegation held firm on the core principles: acknowledgement, reparations, and accountability. On the 3rd cycle, Zekthar requested a private communication channel with the human delegation. Krell, as official observer, was permitted to monitor but not participate. "You have won," Zekthar said, his voice carrying a weariness that transcended species. "Not completely, but enough. The Vrex High Command has authorized me to accept modified versions of your terms. We will acknowledge responsibility. We will provide reparations over a 50-cycle period, and we will surrender 3 commanders for trial, though not all those you demanded. Kowalski leaned forward. Which 3? Those who ordered the deployment of planet killers against civilian targets. The High Command considers their actions excessive even by our standards. They will face your justice. Zekthar paused. But understand this, humans. You have made an enemy that will remember. The Vrex do not forget humiliation. Reeves smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Good, remember it well. Remember it every time you consider attacking another peaceful species. Remember it when you think about expanding your territory through conquest. Remember that somewhere out there humans are watching, and we've learned a lot about warfare from you. The peace treaty was signed 2 cycles later. The Vrex agreed to pay reparations equivalent to 5% of their gross system product for 50 cycles. They formally acknowledged initiating an unprovoked war of aggression. 3 high-ranking commanders were surrendered to human custody, where they would face trial for war crimes. In return, human forces withdrew from Vrex territory. The attacks on Vrex civilian infrastructure ceased. Both sides established a demilitarized zone and agreed to regular diplomatic communication to prevent future conflicts. Krell watched the signing ceremony from his observation post. He had documented every moment of the war, from the first desperate battle to this final diplomatic resolution. His recordings would become part of the Galactic Archive, studied by military historians and diplomatic scholars for generations. But as he watched the humans depart the council station, something nagged at his consciousness. This wasn't the end of humanity's story. It was the beginning of something else. The humans had proven they could fight a major galactic power to a standstill. They had demonstrated tactical innovation, strategic patience, and a willingness to sustain casualties that would have broken other species. More importantly, they had shown the galaxy that they understood how to project power, how to negotiate from strength, and how to demand accountability. Valzine appeared beside his station one final time. Your observation duty is complete. The war is over. You may return to Council headquarters and begin compiling your final report. Krell turned his sensory stalks toward her. The war is over. But humanity's impact on the galaxy is just beginning. They've changed the rules. Every species that watched this conflict learned that humans can be pushed only so far. They also learned that humans are capable of both great compassion and terrible vengeance. You sound concerned, Valzine observed. I am, Krell admitted, because I spent 260 cycles watching humans adapt, learn, and evolve their approach to warfare. They're going to ICEs and economic systems, and they're going to find ways to excel at all of. 50 cycles had passed since the peace treaty was signed. Krell had returned to his duties as a council observer, documenting other conflicts, other first contacts, other moments of galactic significance. But he found his thoughts returning constantly to humanity, wondering how they had recovered from the devastating war. The council had commissioned him to prepare a follow-up report on post-war human development. It was routine procedure for conflicts of such magnitude. Krell accepted the assignment with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. He established a new observation post in human space, this time with permission and cooperation from human authorities. The difference was immediately apparent. During the war, Krell had observed from hiding, monitoring communications without human knowledge. Now humans knew he was watching and seemed unconcerned by his presence. The first thing Krell noticed was the scale of human reconstruction. The 6 colonies destroyed during the war had been rebuilt, not as exact replicas but as improved versions incorporating lessons learned from wartime experiences. New Perth, the colony that had been sacrificed in a desperate defensive stand, was now a thriving world with a population approaching 2 million. But it wasn't just physical reconstruction. Human society itself had transformed. The war had unified their fractious species in ways that centuries of peace never had. The old national divisions still existed, but they seemed less important now. Humans identified themselves first as human, then as citizens of specific nations or colonies. Krell accessed human cultural networks and found something that disturbed him deeply: memorials, thousands of them. Every colony, every city, every small settlement had erected monuments to those who had died in the war. The names of every casualty were recorded, preserved, and remembered in public ceremonies held annually. He watched footage of one such ceremony on Earth itself, in a place humans called Washington. Millions of humans gathered in silence as names were read aloud, one after another for hours. Krell calculated that reading all the names would take days. Yet humans participated willingly, ensuring their dead were not forgotten. Ambassador Reeves, now serving as humanity's primary representative to the Galactic Council, had been invited to speak at the ceremony. Krell watched her address the assembled humans with words that made his sensory stalks tremble. We remember them not because they died, but because they chose to stand. They could have fled. They could have surrendered. They could have negotiated away their freedom for temporary safety. Instead, they fought, they bled. They taught the galaxy that humanity will not be conquered, will not be enslaved, and will not be ignored. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. We won the war, but they won our future. Never forget what they gave us. The crowd's response was not cheers or celebration. It was a profound silence, broken only by the sound of millions of humans weeping for those they had lost. Krell found himself unable to process the scene properly. Humans mourned their dead while simultaneously honoring their sacrifice. They acknowledged the cost of victory while refusing to regret the choice to fight. Over the next several cycles, Krell documented humanity's emergence as a major galactic power. The reparations from the Vrex had been invested wisely, funding technological research and military development. Human ships now incorporated both their own innovations and reverse-engineered Vrex technology, creating hybrid vessels that performed better than either species' original designs. Human military doctrine had become required study at the Galactic Military Academy, much to the chagrin of established powers. Young officers from dozens of species analyzed human tactics, trying to understand how such an apparently primitive species had fought a major power to a negotiated peace. Krell had been invited to lecture on his observations, an invitation he accepted with mixed feelings. But the most significant change was diplomatic. Humans had gained a seat on the Galactic Council, a position they used to push for reforms in how the Council handled aggressive wars. Ambassador Reeves led the effort to establish protocols for intervention when one species attacked another without provocation. Krell attended a council session where Reeves proposed what humans called the Never Again Initiative. It was a comprehensive framework for collective defense, allowing species to request council military intervention if attacked by a superior force. The proposal was controversial. Established powers like the Vrex argued it would encourage weaker species to provoke conflicts, knowing they had council protection. But Reeves countered with devastating simplicity. The Council failed humanity when we needed help. You watched our worlds burn and did nothing. This initiative ensures that no other species suffers what we suffered. If you oppose it, you're telling the galaxy that you prefer a system where might makes right and the strong can brutalize the weak without consequence. The initiative passed by a narrow margin, fundamentally altering galactic diplomatic norms. Krell realized he was watching history unfold in real time. Humanity, within 50 cycles of nearly being destroyed, had changed the rules of galactic civilization. But Krell was more interested in how the war had changed individual humans. He requested permission to interview survivors, and surprisingly, many agreed to speak with him. They knew he had observed the entire conflict, had documented their darkest moments and greatest triumphs. He met with Captain Maria Santos, who had led the brutal raid on the Vrex command carrier. She was retired now, teaching military history at a human academy. They spoke in her office, surrounded by images of battles and fallen comrades. "Do you regret what you did during the war?" Krell asked her, activating his recording implants with her permission. Santos considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret every life we took, Vrex and human alike. But I don't regret fighting. We were given a choice between slavery and war. We chose war. Some choices don't have good options, only less terrible ones. You killed thousands of Vrex soldiers," Krell pressed. "Does that haunt you?" "Every day," Santos admitted, her voice quiet. "I see their ships breaking apart. I hear the silence after we destroyed that carrier. I know that thousands of beings died because of orders I gave. But I also know that if I hadn't given those orders, thousands of humans would have died instead. War isn't about being a hero. It's about making impossible decisions and living with them afterward. Krell interviewed dozens of other veterans. He spoke with soldiers who had fought in tunnel networks on New Perth, with pilots who had rammed their fighters into Vrex battleships, with engineers who had built weapons from salvaged materials. Each had their own story, their own trauma, their own way of processing what they had experienced. What struck Krell most was their honesty. Humans didn't glorify war or pretend it had been noble. They acknowledged the brutality, the fear, the moral compromises, but they also maintained that it had been necessary, that the alternative would have been worse. He arranged a meeting with Admiral Kowalski, the architect of humanity's strategic victory. The old admiral was ancient now by human standards, his body failing but his mind still sharp. They met in his retirement home overlooking Earth's Pacific Ocean. "I watched you for 260 cycles," Krell told him. "I documented every battle, every strategy session, every moment of triumph and desperation. But I never understood why you were so certain you could win." Kowalski smiled, a tired expression that held both sadness and pride. "I wasn't certain we would win. I was certain we wouldn't lose. There's a difference. The Vrex needed us to surrender or be destroyed. We just needed to make the cost of destroying us higher than they were willing to pay. That's not the same as winning, but it was enough." "You sacrificed millions of your own people," Krell said, not accusingly but seeking to understand. "How did you justify that?" "I didn't justify it. I made the calculation that fighting might kill millions, but surrendering would doom billions to lives of servitude. Future generations would live under Vrex rule, their potential limited by alien masters. I chose to let this generation suffer so future generations could be free." Kowalski's eyes grew distant. "I'll face judgment for that choice when I die. Maybe I'll be forgiven, maybe I won't. But I'd make the same choice again." Krell spent his final cycle of observation watching human children in schools. They learned about the war's history now, studying the battles and strategies their parents and grandparents had lived through. But the curriculum also emphasized the cost, ensuring young humans understood that war was neither glorious nor desirable. One teacher, a woman named Rachel, who had been a child during the war, explained it to her students this way: "We fought because we had to. We won because we refused to quit. But the goal wasn't victory. It was survival. And survival means remembering what we lost so we never have to lose it again." Krell prepared his final report for the council, thousands of pages of documentation, analysis, and personal observations. But as he compiled the data, he realized the most important insights couldn't be captured in formal reports. Humanity had taught the galaxy something profound and disturbing. They had shown that seemingly weak species could resist conquest if they were willing to pay the price. They had demonstrated that conventional military doctrine wasn't